Okay, good evening, everybody. So we've been having a Sangha Night theme around light in the darkness. This has been about the story of the Buddha's enlightenment and his first attempts to communicate his vision. Vedanya started the series by describing the mythic story of the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, where he had to deal with Mara's various attempts to distract him, including his hideous armies, the daughters, and also try to sort of undermine, in a sense, his right, really, to be on the diamond throne, to be there, gaining enlightenment. And the Buddha responded with equanimity, fearlessness, and, of course, his famous earth-touching mudra, calling on the earth goddess to witness his right. The experience of enlightenment, this bliss of liberation, is something which is, in a sense, beyond words, beyond our imagination. It's beyond all sort of mundane experience. And according to tradition, the Buddha wondered how he was going to really communicate this vision to unenlightened people. But he had a vision of the suffering of the world, and he shook for all beings, and he saw how humans are like lotus flowers, lotus plants at different stages of development, and how some are sort of still very much in the mud, but others are nearly there. They've just got dust in their eyes. And although he realized he couldn't express the vision directly in words, he saw that he can help people to grow by pointing them towards the light. So he sets off to teach the Dharma, and initially he decides to start with his old friends, the 5 ascetics, who he'd spent a number of years with, undertaking all sorts of hideous ascetic practices to try and sort of go beyond the body. And they were none too pleased with him because he'd, in a sense, left, he'd walked away, he'd started eating food, he started eating milk and rice, which I sort of imagine in modern parlance they might have said to him, well, you know, that's not even vegan, you know. What do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing, you know? But they saw he'd changed, and they started, in a sense, paying attention to what he had to say. So he set in motion the wheel of the Dharma, as we say, the Dharma chakra, which is often symbolized by an 8-spoke wheel, as we've got one beautifully put on the shrine here by Vimaladasa and Izzy. By the way, a very beautiful shrine, thank you. And this can be seen as representing the Noble Eightfold Path, which was part of the path of vision and transformation, which was a part of the first teaching, really, of the Buddha. And the Buddha started with the 4 Noble Truths, which Sangha described last week, beautifully described last week, that includes the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, craving, the truth of the cessation of suffering, the cure, and the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the treatment, the path towards liberation. It's been said, actually, that the figure of the Buddha represents the path to happiness, ultimately. But behind this teaching, there is a big idea that underpins it. So I'm sure you're beginning to ask, what is the big idea? Because that's what I've been asked to talk about. So, yes, there it is, the big idea. It's quite a big word, isn't it? When Paranita asked me to give this talk, I thought, great, I've not given a talk at Sangha Night before. You know, it's a good opportunity, a little bit nervous, but, you know, you're a nice bunch of people. And then she told me what the topic was, Paticca, and I thought, I can barely even pronounce the word. I certainly can't spell it. And, you know, and it's a word that, in a sense, is a word that's trying to describe something that's wordless. So, but anyway, I'll do my best. So, the other thing I'll do is I'll say I will, in a past life, I was an academic. You always had to reference your sources. This was always a really important thing to do. Obviously, it all comes from the Buddha, ultimately. But in terms of specifically the words I'm going to use, Vidanya made some great suggestions. I'd also wanted to thank Padma Bandhu because he gave a really good talk on this subject. And he was my public preceptor, so he put this case around my neck, which was rather nice. And I have already thanked him for his contribution as well. So the Buddha needed to try to express what he'd seen in words. And in a sense, this is impossible. But the idea he chose that got closest to it is Praticca Samuppada. So what does it mean? And before I say that, just two things to bear in mind. One is, as we say over and over again, this is an attempt to put an experience into words. It's only a finger pointing to the moon, wherever the moon is at the moment. We have the added problem that we're translating a word which comes from over 2,000 years ago, from a very different culture, time, language, and meaning is actually quite hard, I think, to translate. But let's do our best. So we've got this word, Praticca. Actually, I'll bring it back up again, shall I? There we go. Praticca Samuppada. So you can, and I won't be doing this for too long, this is Praticca. Praticca means dependent on, Samut means same, and Pada means arising. So this means dependent on same arising, which is a bit clunky, doesn't work particularly well. But it has been translated in various other ways. So it's been translated as conditioned co-production. Now that's a word I'd come across before. As a health services researcher, we're always told that our research should be co-produced with patients or service users. So I sort of got that. So it's something that sort of happens together. There's a togetherness about it. Another translation is dependent co-arising. But the one that I think comes closest is a sort of a mutual co-arising, okay? You're beginning to think this is all starting to sound a bit abstract, but hopefully we'll get a bit closer as the talk goes on. So an early explanation by the Buddha, which Sangha Gita read out last night, is on that wooden block above Daisingha's head. And I'll read the words. This being that becomes, from the arising of this, that arises, this not being that does not become, from the ceasing of this, that ceases. Buddhaghosa, a 5th century commentator, said that in a sense this sort of conveys something like arises as a togetherness. Thus it is a co-arising. So things are dependent on conditions and cease with the cessation of those conditions. Now, I think it's impossible to exaggerate the importance of this idea in Buddhism. It's the central idea underpinning what often we call the sort of basic or essential Buddhism. It's a sort of universal principle that's accepted by all schools. And I think the essential point is that all things, physical, psychological, whatever they are conditioned. And the implications of this are huge. For example, it means that all things are by nature impermanent. They're in a constant state of flux, not separate, not independent. I mean, this has huge implications. Now, it can all start to sound a bit abstract, hard to fathom. Well, don't worry, you're not alone. Indeed, the Buddha himself warned against assuming you understand it. So I'm going to give a few examples, which hopefully will get us maybe a bit closer to what it's about. So the first one is you're walking through a field, a lovely day, and you spot this enormous oak tree in the middle of the field. Great big old oak tree. Being a good Buddhist, you will ask yourself, what conditions led to that tree being there? There's the obvious things. There's rain, there's sun, there's earth, all those sorts of things. There's, at some point, probably several hundred years ago, an acorn landed in that area. Maybe a bird came along, fell out of its mouth, I don't know, or maybe a squirrel forgot it was there. Who knows? You know, there's all sorts of possible conditions. And then And it didn't get chopped down. Why didn't the farmer chop it down? It must be quite awkward to have a great big oak tree in the middle of the field. Maybe he liked the look of it, or maybe it was just too big to chop down. Who knows? These are all conditions leading to that tree being a tree there and then when you're in the field. And then if you pan out further back, you think about what process of evolution gave rise to this being a tree? What processes of evolution gave rise to all sorts of conditions that enabled that tree to be there? I've been watching a program called Earth with Chris Packham, which is all about how life came to be on Earth over the last 2.5 billion years. And it's extraordinary, some of the events that happened, asteroids, massive volcanic eruptions, methane clouds, all sorts of things led to life sort of where it is now. So when you think about it, the conditions involved in that tree being a tree are just limitless. I'm going to give another example, which I know Bodhi Naga will like, which is around football. Now, Harry Kane used to score goals for Spurs, and that makes me sad because I'm a Spurs supporter and he now plays for Bayern Munich. More importantly, perhaps, Real Madrid's left back, Olga Carmona, scored a goal for Spain against England in the World Cup final. I see a lot of sad faces now. But you have to ask yourself, who exactly scored those goals? What are goals? Again, you don't need to know much about football to realise that it's a team game. Harry Kane could not score a goal against another Premiership team on his own. You wouldn't have a hope in hell. So it's a team game. Even Harry Kane, yeah. And then there's all the people who train them, the supporters. There's the rules of football that were invented in the mid-19th century by some English gentlemen, I don't know. There's the existence of two nation states, Spain and England. We could well have been a part of Spain at one point in history. There are so many conditions involved that, in a sense, that had to arise. In a sense, you could say that these goals were a mutual arising. And actually, nobody won the game of football at all. So we as English people can take that as some consolation. Everything is governed by and sustained by a very complex web of conditions, impossible to imagine. It's even beyond the biggest, most complicated mathematical model you can possibly come up with. Because there are some people who'd say, well, one day we will be able to model all this. We'll understand it all, like a kind of sort of rationalist heaven. But of course, that would miss the point. There's something much more subtle and deep going on. Ananda famously said, it's amazing. Ananda was looked after the Buddha in his later life. It's amazing, Lord. It's astounding how deep this dependent co-arising is and how deep its appearance. And yet to me, it seems as clear as clear can be. And the Buddha in response said, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. And elsewhere, the Buddha described his teaching as deep, hard to perceive, hard to understand, beyond logic, subtle, intelligible only to the wise. So this mutual co-arising, it does include cause and effect, but it's a very complex form of conditionality. But it even goes beyond that. It goes beyond, it's more than just about physical objects like trees or events like football. It's about how our mind and the world we experience mutually condition each other and evolve together. The way our preconceptions, our predispositions shape the reality that we see. I'm going to quote probably one of the most quoted lines in the Dhammapada. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. So it's about going beyond any sort of simple idea of a subjective me seeing an object, me seeing a tree. Everything, mind and matter, are a part of a whole. Now, this is something which is very hard to understand. We do not understand it, indeed, unless we count ourselves among the enlightened. It goes right back to the Buddha's enlightenment being an experience or a direct knowing, not a knowing like some piece of philosophy or science. Vedanta gives the example often of trying, how would you describe the colour blue to somebody who's blind? There's some characteristics you might be able to say, but fundamentally you couldn't describe the experience of actually seeing the colour. But having said all that, we do need words. We need a finger pointing to the moon. We need some kind of map, and ideally we need a good map, a map that's going to ultimately get us there. And this map, if you like, sometimes you could see it as right view in terms of the Noble Eightfold Path. But teachings like Paticca and the Four Noble Truths are there as sort of a maps to help guide us. But before I go into some implications of this big idea, I just wanted to show a few images which I think help us go a bit beyond words, perhaps in a slightly more sort of creative way. So let's have a look. Okay. You may have not seen this before. This is called the endless knot. Okay. Now, before you start thinking it sounds like some horrendous Boy Scout badge test, this is actually one of the 8 auspicious symbols in Tibetan Buddhism, and it's an image which is about trying to portray the way things are interconnected, the way things are interconnected. And you can see that in a sense there's no beginning and there's no end. Everything is interconnected. Now I've got a rather more far out sort of symbol. Here we go. Yep, some of you are looking at it thinking, what on earth is that? This is Indra's net, or an attempt to portray Indra's net. So what is Indra's net? Now, this is an image which is, again, is trying to convey interconnectedness, but in quite a profound way. Indra is the king of gods in sort of ancient India, has this net or web made of jewels. And here it's being used to show what the enlightened mind can see. And somebody called Timothy Brook describes Indra's net as follows. When Indra fashioned the world, he made it as a web, and at every knot in the web is tied a pearl. Everything that exists or has ever existed, every idea that can be thought about, every datum that is true, every Dharma, in the language of Indian philosophy, is a pearl in the Indra's net. Not only is every pearl tied to every other pearl by virtue of the web on which they hang, but on the surface of every pearl is reflected every other jewel on the net. Everything that exists in Indra's web implies all else that exists. And as Sangha Night says, all things contain all things. So it's a sort of an image that's trying to convey something about interconnectedness in this sort of slightly beyond words, something, a sort of an image, which may help. Then the next image, which is actually quite hard to see from back there, is one which perhaps we see more familiarly around here, which is the Wheel of Life, the Tibetan Wheel of Life. The Tibetan Wheel of Life is a very complicated symbol. You could run a whole theme of Sangha Nights on it quite easily. But what I just wanted to sort of focus on, because the outer ring here portrays one of the Buddha's sort of first teachings about the nature of conditionality, Paticca, which is the 12 nidanas, the 12 links. And this basically portrays the way in which we go round in life, round and round in this sort of circle. And each link, if you like, leads to the next. Each link leads to the next. Unless we free ourselves, in a sense, from this circle of life. Now, the part of it which we're all familiar with, when we talk on the newcomers course, for example, about the gap, is it has 3 parts. So there's the contact, and here we've got a contact. We've got 2 people sort of vaguely canoodling. That's a sort of contact. It could be a positive contact, could be a negative contact. In terms of the gap, it could be somebody swerves in front of you as you're driving along, something like that. There's something that triggers. And then arises a feeling, and there's a chap with the arrow in his eye. There's a feeling, could be pleasure, could be pain. The contact, you couldn't stop that. The pleasure and the pain that arises from that at that moment, there's nothing much you can do about it. But then what tends to arise, if it's a pleasurable thing, is craving. We tend to talk about chocolate in that sort of situation. You have one piece of chocolate, you think, that was nice. You don't just enjoy the pleasure, you think, oh, I want another piece now, and another piece. But I won't go into chocolate because it's certainly not the worst thing you can do with your life. But there's, it gets a hard rap sometimes, chocolate, doesn't it? But there's also the ill will version, you stub your toe, or as I say, the driver coming in and you experience anger, ill will, it sort of rises up. So, and when we suffer, we tell ourselves stories. We say, as Sangha Gita went in last week, we say, oh, poor me. And these other arrows start hitting you, about why did that person pick on me? Why did that person drive in front of me? Who do they think they are? People are always doing this to me. You get into that sort of syndrome. And of course, the practice that Sangha Gita was talking about last week is seeing that other people suffer too. It's a part of life, getting some sort of sense of equanimity, and also, of course, metta for others as well who are suffering. I mean, we're all subject to this ever-changing flow of conditions, many of which are beyond our control. But we keep getting caught out by it. We keep getting surprised by it. We forget that life in many ways, not all the time, but overall is unsatisfactory. Sure, there are good things and bad things happen, but ultimately overall unsatisfactory. And Sangha Gita talked about dukkha, or this ill-fitting wheel. I should imagine ox carts are pretty uncomfortable, particularly if you've got an ill-fitting wheel. I should imagine that probably makes it doubly worse. So when we get this sense of suffering, this sense of unsatisfactoriness, we often look for something. We go in search. May not be the one search, it may be something that happens over time, but essentially we are looking for something a bit deeper, trying to sort of get to the bottom of things. And when we find something, we respond. Perhaps we see something that makes sense. We see something that inspires us. We respond in a slightly more positive sort of way. And this can provide a sort of a way out of this reactive sort of cycle. So you have this sense of suffering, whatever it is, you have a contact with something that takes you a bit higher, a bit beyond perhaps your normal way of seeing the world. And this helps lift you up out of it into sometimes what's called the spiral. And this is the spiral of conditionality. And the Buddha also taught not just these 12 nidanas of negative conditionality, but positive conditionality as well, that positive mental states lead to more positive mental states. And this is like a sort of an unfolding. So as long as often we tend to stick with our old reactions, but slowly over time, we can start to notice changes in what we do, even from our practices as a Buddhist, being ethical, being mindful and so on. We can begin to see the benefits, the fruits. So I just wanted to talk about a few practical implications of conditionality. One is that conditionality is reciprocal. So it's not like a simple causality, X, Y is a function of X, X affects Y, whatever it is. Well, one good example is, the Greek got it right, healthy body, healthy mind, a healthy body where you have a good diet, drink plenty of water, have a reasonable amount of exercise. There's no doubt that helps the mind, helps clear the mind. Equally, a healthy mind is good for the body. Plenty of evidence around for that. The other one I quite like is the relationship between at least thoughts and emotions, minds and emotions. All of these things are inseparable. In a sense, that's the point. But it's quite interesting the way the mind can stoke up emotions. You can be walking along on a perfectly good day, lovely sunny day, and suddenly you think of something somebody did 10 years ago that annoyed you at the time, and it starts annoying you again. No rational reason, this person is miles away, they could be in another country. They're probably not thinking about you at all. And yet it stokes something up. I remember years ago in the 70s, there used to be something called Casey Jones, a US series, a terrible children's series. And there was a song about Casey Jones. And in that song, it mentions Fireman Wally. And Fireman Wally was the guy who used to put fuel in the steam engine, with the coal, shoveling it in, fueling our sort of emotional reactions. And that's what our mind does. But equally, our emotions affect our mind and our thoughts. So again, it's an example of this sort of the way things are reciprocal. So obviously, what we try and do is put our energies behind positive thoughts, positive emotions, and so on. The next thing, which I've already sort of said, is conditionality is not causality. Okay, and this can be a bitter disappointment. I'm somebody who doesn't always have great nights sleeping. I try my best. I make sure all the light is excluded by blinds and curtains. I don't drink alcohol. I don't drink tea or coffee after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't drink anything after about 6 o'clock if I can help it. I don't watch high-wired sort of difficult psychodramas, at 10 at night. I do all these things, I still don't have a great night's sleep. I create the best conditions I can, but it doesn't always work. It's not causality. When it comes to something like meditation, unfortunately, the same rules apply. So again, you can try and create the best imaginable conditions. You can go off on a retreat, reduce input, lead a simpler life, lead a very quiet life for 2 weeks, say. And then you get about halfway through and you begin to think, where are the dhyanas? What's gone wrong? I've created all these conditions, but where are those higher states that I was after? As anybody will tell you, well, we all know in a way, is that expectations will always kill a good meditation experience. You can create the best conditions you like, but what you need to do is, rather than expect that you'll get into great mental states, is to allow things to unfold, because things will happen of their own accord. And the same is true of the Dharma life in general. Whether you're behaving ethically doesn't guarantee that things will work out well, and so on. But having said all that, don't underestimate the importance of external conditions. The place we work, our friends, what we read, what we watch on TV, how we spend our time, all are creating conditions. Obviously, some things we can't avoid. We've got responsibilities, family, jobs, etc. But conditions are nonetheless important. So despite what I've been saying about conditionality, that it's not causality, do go on retreats, seek out inspiration in what you read, live ethically and so on, and use the space that you have wisely. I just want to say something about space, because one of the things I think about conditionality is that we can all reflect on it to some extent. That's it. We can all reflect on it. Obviously, you can formally reflect on it. You can give yourself time. I think Sangha was famous for actually putting time in his diary to reflect on things. I don't think many of us do that. But we do have space. And a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about Virochana, who's a figure who represents, in a sense, represents enlightenment, and about space and how the importance of space in our day, in our week. We often tend to see our lives as a sort of continuous stream of activities. But actually, there is a lot more space in our day than you think. The space, obviously, there's meditation space. You can, if you can, you can build in time. But even less formally, you have time, whether it's waiting for a bus, walking to work, traveling between jobs, and so on. There is space in our lives. And Sangha, in Crossing the Stream, wrote a couple of things actually about space or pauses. And he says this: when the composer Mozart was asked what was the most important part of his music, he didn't reply the melody or harmony or counterpoint, or even the orchestration was the most important, but simply the pauses. And just as the pauses are the most important part of music, and the empty spaces the most important part of a picture, so are silence and emptiness the most important part of life. Life which consists of a frantic stream of external activities, without one moment of inward recollection, is like music which is an uninterrupted succession of sound or a picture which is crammed with figures. All three are not only meaningless, but positively painful. It is the pauses which make beautiful the music of our lives. It is the empty spaces which give richness and significance to them. And it is stillness which makes them truly useful. So we do have some spaces, some of us perhaps more than others, but it's a bit of a modern thing, which is as soon as we have any time, you're waiting at a bus stop or you're waiting to see somebody, we look at our phone. It's almost as though the phone is sort of taunting us. It's saying something like, I'm here, look at me. You know, I could entertain you for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever little time bubble you've got. But actually these sorts of time bubbles, these sorts of opportunities are rare, seem like they're a rare thing, but actually they're not. Because praticca I think, is something that arises in our sort of day-to-day lives. It's something that's happening every moment. And there are all sorts of events, activities, and so on, which are there going on in the background, which if we just pay a bit of attention, we can notice. We have a tendency to cut up to, we have this experience, which is going on all the time. As I say, everything is impermanent in the state of flux. We have a tendency to chop it all up into chunks, create stories about it. So, for example, I might say I'm an introvert, therefore I don't like Sangha Night. But you say something like that, and it's incredibly, incredibly limiting. Life events. It could be big events. It's interesting that the classic one is funerals. It makes people think what's going on. Or it could be, as I say, somebody cutting you up in a traffic jam. Just noticing your reactions to the most simple things around you, the way somebody talks to you, maybe positive, maybe negative. It certainly doesn't have to be just negative. But these sorts of things give you an opportunity to reflect on what's happening in life, and your experience of that deep down inside. As I say, it can also be positive things. I think it's very important in all this to remember we are a part of life. We're in a sense contributing to life, and we do positive things. I remember years ago when I was a parent, you'd have a child who was very demanding. You'd do everything you could for them, etc., etc. Sometimes you just moved on and you didn't kind of congratulate yourself or whoever else was involved, just to sort of acknowledge what you were doing. Equally, you could be in the street helping somebody. Acknowledging these sorts of things and the way you've responded to conditions is all part of it. There's no limit. There's no limit to what you can do. So lastly, an important part of all this is to see praticca life in a place of metta, of kindness. It's ill will and anger, I think Parabandhu said, that can make us stupid. It's also kinder to ourselves. Last week, Sangha Gita introduced a new way of looking at the breath that I really liked, and I think it's actually a really useful thing to have up your sleeve, which is on the out breath, think anything can happen. Anything can happen in the next half hour. And on the in breath, I can bring kindness to that experience. I just found that really helpful, really helpful. So, as the image of Indra's net conjures up, praticca is describing ultimate reality, and this is a place of great beauty and magic and potential. We can experience something of its beauty, clarity, expansiveness, energy, light, and love in our meditation, but also in reflection, in pujas, Dharma talks, discussions, wherever, in a sense, the truth sort of resonates. And this is something which I think inspires us all. I just wanted to finish on the same poem as we finished last week, Life is King, because I think it captures very well, I think, the essence of this. So Life is King by Sangha Night. Hour after hour, day after day, we try to grasp the ungraspable, pinpoint the unpredictable. Flowers wither when touched. Ice suddenly cracks beneath our feet. Vainly we try to track bird flight through the sky. Trace dumb fish through deep water. Try to anticipate the earned smile, the soft reward. Even try to grasp our lives. But life slips through our fingers like snow. Life cannot belong to us. We belong to life. Life is king. Thank you. Thank you. You've been a lovely audience. So we've got the usual thing. So in our groups, we thought we'd like you to consider this. You might consider other things, but consider this. Think about all the people who have made you the person you are now. It'd be hard to think of all the people, maybe just one person, whatever, just somebody or people who you think have helped make you the person you are. So, in terms of groups, the Wednesday night newcomers are in the green room. The Monday night group with me are in the library. The men's group in the Red Shrine room, women's group in the bookshop, and mixed groups here in the Great Hall. Okay, thank you.